Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock. We appreciate, as always, you taking time to watch this week's video. On today's program, I want to talk about the rise of China and its escalating acts of aggression. Now, many people believe that China may be sensing some weakness right now in our government and in the White House, and they're seizing what they see to kind of be a strategic window of opportunity. So I want to talk about that. I mean, China, I think, will be a key player in the end times, according to Scripture. We want to talk about what China is doing today. They kind of seem to keep pushing the envelope and pressing forward. And what we see today, I think, is setting the stage for what's coming in the future. Now, in a bit, we'll go to the subscriber-only section, and we'll answer the questions that are sent in by our subscribers. And let me just give you a little preview of these questions. Several of these relate to the issue of Genesis chapter 6, and several of these relate to Genesis chapter 6 and that very mysterious passage about the sons of God and the daughters of men and the Nephilim. One question is, I have a hard time believing that God created the angels with genitals, which would make them able to reproduce with women on the earth. Any thoughts? Then kind of a related question to that, can you explain how the angels had the capacity to reproduce if in heaven, where they came from, there's no reproduction with each other as far as we know? And then another question says, I believe God knitted us perfectly together in our mother's wombs. We're also made in his image. And yet studies show that some boys and girls are born in the wrong body or are naturally attracted to the same sex. I just don't know in which light I have to see this. Do these studies simply deceive us, and is science once again lying to us? Could it also be possible that these studies are true, and maybe these people are infected with Nephilim seed? Again, referring back to Genesis chapter 6. And then one final question. I'm sure this is something many of you have asked. Maybe you've been asked this or faced this yourself. But this question asks, in the scripture, it says that our bodies will rise. So is it wrong to be cremated to ashes instead of being buried in the earth? So I'm going to give a pretty extensive answer to that question. 8 reasons why I think the Bible favors burial over cremation. So I think you'll want to stay tuned for that. Well, what I want to talk about again today is this idea of just the escalating attempts to kind of push the envelope by China that we see in our world today. One thing I wanted to mention about this is President Trump's new vice president pick, J.D. Vance, in Fortune magazine. They're saying that he's saying China is the biggest threat to the United States. So Vance is a China hawk, and he's in favor of turning American attention away from Ukraine and back to the Pacific, back to China. So there are a lot of things happening just in our country that seems to be putting more focus on China than other parts of the world right now. China recently, with Russia, conducted joint naval drills just after the NATO meetings. So this is kind of their response to that. These happened in the South China Sea, and these were live fire naval exercises that were taking place there. I mean, recent days, Chinese troops have been sent to Belarus, which is a close ally of Russia, where Russia has actually placed nuclear arsenal there. They've been going there, China has, and conducting joint troop exercises in Belarus. So that's a very interesting development. According to authorities in Taiwan, and by the way, a lot of this I'm getting is from an article in Prophecy News Watch. But they say, according to authorities in Taiwan, 66 Chinese military aircraft and 7 Chinese military vessels were operating around Taiwan last week. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense on Thursday said it had detected 66 Chinese military aircraft and vessels around the island, apparently en route to a Chinese military exercise in the Western Pacific. The Chinese Communist Party consistently insists that Taiwan is Chinese territory and that reunification is going to take place at some point in time in the future. And of course, no one knows when that's going to take place, but I think they're looking for that opportune strategic time to make that move. And I think they're getting a lot of encouragement from that, from what they see happening with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Now, when asked about all this kind of aggression around Taiwan, the Chinese government responded by declaring the operation was about protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Chinese have been aggressively probing Taiwan's naval defenses. During the first 6 months of 2024, the Taiwanese Coast Guard drove away 567 Chinese boats. Now, China is even actually venturing out much further afield. It's been reported that 4 Chinese military vessels were just spotted off the coast of Alaska. Now, these multiple military ships were in international waters, but the Coast Guard said they were inside what's called the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone, which extends about 200 nautical miles from the U.S. Shoreline. So we can just see China here just continuing to move and to push and prod and kind of give these little kind of pinprick actions of aggression, just kind of testing the waters to see what the response will be in each of these cases. The reason that these vessels off the coast of Alaska, the reason that's noteworthy is because this is very unusual. Chinese military vessels usually don't operate that far north. And most people don't realize this, but China now has the largest navy on the planet. And they're using this to expand their sphere of influence. The same article in Prophecy News Watch had something in there that to me is really shocking to hear. It says this: our own military industry has become extremely dependent on the Chinese. It's been reported that Chinese semiconductors are in approximately 40% of all U.S. Department of Defense weapon systems and infrastructure. So 40% of our weapons require semiconductors from China. Now, you talk about being compromised. We had a problem some years ago because of these semiconductors that are used in automobiles that slowed down automobile production. But this is in our weapons. It says a large number of Chinese semiconductors are used in critical military platforms, accounting for around 40% of all U.S. Department of Defense weapon systems. They're further linked to military supply chains such as Patriot air defense missiles and B-2 bombers. For example, a Lockheed Martin missile factory situated in Alabama produces Javelin anti-tank weapons, which use more than 200 semiconductors in each weapon. So that equates to thousands of Chinese semiconductors in U.S. weaponry that's used. And many of these essential components in sensitive U.S. military systems now come from China. So this is a very disturbing thing that we see in our country today of how they have control over us. One thing I thought was really interesting is whenever the assassination attempt against President Trump took place, there was a response from President Xi Jinping in China. Of course, he gave his sympathies to President Trump, according to a statement. But a newspaper owned by the country's ruling Communist Party published several editorial articles quoting different Chinese academics. And many of them said that the U.S. was becoming increasingly polarized and at risk of potential civil war. So over in China, they're seeing this as an opportunity. They're seeing the fracture in our country. They're using a lot of this, too, to bring in disinformation through all kinds of different social media platforms into our country. So they see a real opportunity, a real window of opportunity here, I think, as well, to seize on this and to try to drive a greater wedge here in America and in our politics. One other thought here related to China is China has what is called the third plenum that has taken place. The Chinese Communist Party has, of course, closed-door meetings. We'll never know what happens there. But in China, they have a major congress twice a decade of all their leaders. But in between these congresses, the Central Committee holds 7 plenums that are attended by all of its current 205 members and 171 alternate members. They have 7 of these. The first, second, and 7th plenums focus on power transition between the central committees. The 4th and 6th plenums center on the party ideology. But in recent decades, this 3rd plenum, which is taking place this last week, focuses on long-term economic reforms. And this 3rd plenum that's taken place has been described by Chinese state media as epoch-making. It's expected to deliver major initiatives to address the risks and obstacles related to China's long-term social and economic progress. So they're having this epoch-making meeting, and of course, all their meetings there are behind closed doors. So no one knows what's taking place there. But again, could it be related to an invasion of Taiwan? Certainly that would boost their economy hugely if they could go and take over Taiwan and all the infrastructure that's there. Time will tell what's taking place. But we do know that in the Bible predicts a massive confederation of nations mentioned in conjunction with the campaign of Armageddon. In Revelation chapter 16, verse 12, it says the Euphrates River will be dried up that the way might be prepared for the kings from the east. And we know that these kings from the east come from east of the Euphrates River because it has to be dried up for their advance. Of course, there's a lot of nations east of the Euphrates, but the major player now obviously is China. Now, the mention in Revelation 16 of the Euphrates being dried up and this army coming in, the kings of the east, many see a parallel between that and in Revelation 9, where you have some angels that are released at the Euphrates River and an army of 200 million. So they believe the army of 200 million and this army from the east is the same. Now, I've mentioned this before. I believe that the army of 200 million in Revelation 9 is a demonic army. I don't see that as a human army because of several things that are in that passage. But some see that connection because both of those mention the Euphrates River and they both mention a huge army. But either way, China, it seems, will be a key player in these end time events. And what we see happening today with China, it's just a powder keg there where eventually with all that they're doing in Russia, with Russia, encouraging Russia and Ukraine, they're going to attack Taiwan and absorb that into their nation at some point in time. How will the U.S. respond to that? All these things are taking place with China being positioned now really as the other great nation besides the United States. And if the rapture were to take place and the U.S. was reduced suddenly to from our superpower status, that would elevate China to be the major player in our world today. So God is setting the stage today through what we see happening both in our country but also in China as well. We're going to go now to the subscriber-only section. I'll answer those questions that I previewed earlier. If you're not a subscriber, you can go to endtimes.com for $7 a month. You can sign up there and have access to a lot of great information that I think will give you a real heads up on what's happening in our world today and help you understand Bible prophecy better and help you understand our world better in light of what's coming. So we'll go to those questions now and answer these questions that are sent in by our subscribers.